The story of the Catholic Church unfolds over almost 2,000 years. It's the story of a family, the united family of God. Like any family, our story is full of saints and sinners, courage and cowardice, success and failure. But it's our story, and we should know it. It would be impossible in a short video to cover the complexity, depth, and richness of Catholic Church history. So I'll just focus on those things that every Catholic should know to understand how we got to where we are today and where we might be going. It's not surprising that a common image for the Church is that of a ship at sea, tossed around by the waves but never going under. While there have been many storms in our history, the bark of Peter has somehow managed to stay afloat. Some have even called it miraculous. As Catholics, we know that we have Jesus' promise that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. So, let's get this story started. First, every Catholic should know when the Church was founded and by whom. The Catholic Church was founded by Jesus Christ and began her mission on Pentecost Sunday around the year 33 AD. The Acts of the Apostles tell the story of the early Church, how she started in Jerusalem, and then took the gospel to the ends of the earth. We have other writings that also give us insights to life in the early Church, like the Didache, Clement's letters to the Corinthians, and the letters of St. Ignatius on his way to Rome to be martyred. Next, every Catholic should know something about the Church Fathers. The first centuries of the Church are divided into two ages, the Apostolic Age and the Patristic Age, or the Age of the Fathers. The Apostolic Age ended with the death of the last apostle, St. John, around the year 100. The Age of the Fathers continued for the next 6.5 centuries, ending in 749. The Church Fathers were the earliest teachers and defenders of the Christian faith. Most were bishops, although certain priests, deacons, and laymen were also recognized as fathers. To be called a father of the Church, one had to have lived in the first 7 centuries of the Church, wrote and taught Orthodox doctrine, and lived a holy life. Were there any mothers of the Church? Possibly. We know that women played an important role in the early Church, but we don't have any writings from which we can say they were teachers of the faith. Keep in mind, though, we do have a mother of the Church, our Holy Mother, Mary. Every Catholic should know that the early Church was persecuted, and when it finally stopped. Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire until the 4th century. The early Christians were in fact called atheists because they refused to bow down before the pagan gods. You've probably heard that the early Christians were mercilessly persecuted by the Roman Empire, and indeed, some of them were. However, persecution was not constant, and not all Christians were persecuted. Persecutions happened at different times, under specific leaders, and in particular locations. The first began in Rome under Emperor Nero in 64 AD. Church tradition holds that Saints Peter and Paul were both martyred by Nero. Over the next 250 years, many of the Church's leaders were martyred, including as many as 28 of the first 31 popes. The others were exiled. In 313, Emperor Constantine granted freedom to the Church through the Edict of Milan. Christians were now free to worship openly, but Christianity was not yet the state religion. According to legend, Constantine's mother, Saint Helena, visited Palestine around 327 and discovered the wood of the true cross and other holy sites. Constantine ordered churches to be built on these sites, including the Church of the Nativity and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This gave rise to pilgrimages to the Holy Land that have continued down to this day. In 380, Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the state religion in the Roman Empire with the Edict of Thessalonica. This marked the beginning of a long love-hate relationship between church and state that took centuries to resolve. Some might say we're still working on it. After the Edict of Milan, the young church emerged from the catacombs and secret house churches to lay the foundations for a new Christian society. The 4th century was a time of great freedom for the church, but was also the century of the terrible Arian crisis. Every Catholic should know about the Arian crisis and its impact on the early church. Almost as soon as Christ ascended into heaven, his teachings were distorted by false teachers. The early bishops played a relentless game of whack-a-mole against these false teachings, or heresies. Around 318, a priest in Alexandria named Arius started teaching that Jesus Christ was a created being, neither divine nor eternal, or, as the Arians like to say, there was a time when he was not. For Arius, there was only the Father in the Godhead. It was not a Trinity. The Arian heresy spread throughout the Church, starting a fire that the bishops battled for most of the 4th century. The crisis threatened to tear the young Church apart, as believers didn't know where the true faith lay. Bishops were even divided among themselves. The whole Catholic faith hung in the balance. If Christ is not divine, then we have not been redeemed. Saint Athanasius emerged as the father of orthodoxy and chief defender of the Trinitarian faith, despite repeated exiles and humiliations. Thanks to his heroic efforts, the flames of Arianism were finally extinguished in the Church, although the embers continue to this day. Which takes us to our next topic. Every Catholic should know where we got the Nicene Creed and why it's so important. The Arian crisis not only threatened the Church, it threatened the Empire.
Thus, it was Constantine who called the Council of Nicaea in 325 to end the fighting and to bring peace to his empire.
The Fathers provided an ultimate response to the Arian heresy by confirming the Church's belief in the divinity of Christ. To do this, they used the Greek word homoousios, which means of one substance, or, as we say today, Christ is consubstantial with the Father. But the fight wasn't over. Arianism continued to influence both clergy and the faithful for the next half-century, even as a new heresy arose that denied the divinity of the Holy Spirit, and therefore the Trinity. Finally, at the Council of Constantinople in 381, the Fathers declared the Trinitarian doctrine and the equality of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, adding these words to the Nicene Creed. The Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, with the Father and the Son, is worshipped and glorified. The Nicene Creed that we say today stands as a testament to the zeal of the Fathers for getting it right. But that wasn't the end of the controversy. When the Creed was translated into Latin in 589, the translators inserted the words, "and the Son," or the filioque clause. This set off another centuries-long battle that would end tragically in schism. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Every Catholic should know that the Church did not stifle human progress in the so-called Dark Ages. The first thing we need to know is that the Dark Ages never really happened. While it's true there was cultural and intellectual decline in the 6th and 7th centuries, the cause of this decline was barbarian invasions in the crumbling Roman Empire, not the Catholic Church. The term Dark Ages was created by the enemies of the Church in the late 17th century to deny the incredible accomplishments of the medieval Church, including the Carolinian Renaissance under Charlemagne and the creation of the first universities. This dark period supposedly lasted some 500 to 700 years, depending on who you ask. During this period, the Church did everything she could to reverse cultural decline and bring stability to Western civilization. Which brings us to our next topic. Every Catholic should know about the incredible contribution of the monks. Catholic monasticism is rooted in the lives of devout women who, as early as the 3rd century, became consecrated virgins and lived lives of prayer and sacrifice. About the same time, devout young men retreated to the desert to live as hermits, renouncing worldly things and focusing on the spiritual life. The most famous of these was Saint Anthony of Egypt. Over time, these solitary men and women came to live in communities called monasteries. Around 529, Saint Benedict of Nursia founded the great monastery of Monte Cassino and composed the Rule of Saint Benedict that would govern religious life for centuries with its motto, Ora et labora, or pray and work. It's almost impossible to do justice to the contribution of the monks to Western civilization. Among many other things, the monks preserved the ability to read and write, copied ancient texts, introduced new crops, pioneered new technology, improved the European landscape, looked after the lost and shipwrecked, and invented champagne. Who else in the history of Western civilization can boast such a record? But it wasn't all prayer and work in the early Middle Ages. In Arabia, a new threat was rising. Every Catholic should know about the rise of Islam and its impact on the Church. In 622, a man named Muhammad led his small group of followers from Mecca to Medina in a flight called the Hijra. This signaled the beginning of Islam and almost 1,000 years of invasion and conquest. Shortly after Muhammad's death in 632, the Christian communities in Arabia were entirely destroyed. Just 1 century later, Christians had lost Egypt, Palestine, Syria, North Africa, Spain, most of Asia Minor, and southern France. In fact, 2/3 of the formerly Roman Christian world was now ruled by Muslims. Over the next 7 centuries, Muslims continued to attack the Christian West. By 1453, the great Christian city of Constantinople fell to the Muslims, giving rise to the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, which lasted until the early 20th century. Despite centuries of Muslim invasion, Christians did not retaliate for almost 500 years. In 1097, they launched a series of campaigns called the Crusades. Every Catholic should know the truth about the Crusades. Believe it or not, the Crusades were not a significant event in the Catholic Church or the Muslim world, but that hasn't stopped people from using it as a hammer to beat the Church whenever possible. Many people today think the Crusades were an aggressive act by Western Christians against peace-loving Muslims and their sophisticated societies. However, the Crusades were actually the first great counterattack after centuries of Muslim aggression against Christians. There were several crusades between 1097 and 1265. The stated purpose was to recover the holy places in Palestine, allowing Christians to once again make pilgrimages in relative safety. Many responded to the call, however, people being people,
these noble aims were often forgotten. Shameful things did happen, and a very small number of crusaders profited, at least for a time. But the vast majority of the crusaders either died far from home or were impoverished for their efforts.
In the end, the Crusades failed to achieve anything meaningful and faded away into the mists of history, until many centuries later, when they were revived as a weapon against the Church. The Church's response to Islamic invasion did not end with the Crusades. In 1571, Pope Pius V brought together a coalition of European states called the Holy League, which defeated the Turks in the naval battle of Lepanto. Before the battle, the Pope encouraged the faithful to pray the Rosary and ask for Our Lady's intercession. Following the Holy League's decisive victory, tens of thousands of Christian slaves were freed from the Turkish galleys, and the Pope declared October 7th the Feast of Mary, Queen of Victory, later renamed Feast of the Holy Rosary. The Muslim fleet never again posed a grave danger to Christian states. Just over a century later, on September 12, 1683, the King of Poland, John Sobieski, cooperated with the Holy Roman Empire to defeat the Ottoman Turks in the decisive Battle of Vienna. This battle is often seen as a turning point in Western history. From that point on, Islam no longer threatened the Christian world, after more than 1,000 years of expansion. But let's get back to more troubled times for the Church. Every Catholic should know about the 2 great schisms in the Church. A schism is a serious break with the Church that creates divisions among Christians who should be unified. A schism occurs when a group of believers refuses to submit to the Pope or is no longer in communion with other Catholics, even though they may believe the same things. There were 2 major schisms of note in Church history. The first of these is called the Great Schism, which began in 1054 and marked the separation of the Orthodox churches from unity with the Pope. The reasons for this schism go way back to at least the 4th century. Do you remember that little word, filioque? The Eastern Church believed that the Western Church had changed doctrine, but, as both sides admit today, it really came down to misunderstanding caused by cultural and language differences. Despite efforts to reunite, the Eastern Orthodox and Latin Rite churches remain separated to this day. The second major schism was the Western Schism between 1377 and 1417. This 40-year crisis followed a period of almost 70 years when 7 successive popes resided in Avignon, France, due to the political unrest and social conditions in Rome. Pope Gregory XI moved back to Rome in 1377, but died a year later. After his death, the cardinals in Avignon elected a new pope, while in Rome, opposing factions each selected their own papal candidate. The church was divided between 2 and then 3 different popes at the same time. Catholics didn't know who the true pope was, as cardinal bishops, theologians, kings, and even saints followed different popes. This crisis was finally resolved at the Council of Constance in 1417, when apostolic succession was reconfirmed, and a new pope, Martin V, was elected. All other papal claimants were deposed or resigned. While the church was sorting out her hierarchy, heresies continued to cause trouble in Christendom. The church took action to protect the deposit of faith left to her by Jesus Christ. This protective action was called the Inquisition. Every Catholic should know what the Inquisition was and still is.
The Inquisition was not a single historical event, but rather the mechanism the church used to protect the truth of her teachings.
First founded in the 12th century, the purpose of an inquisition was to defend the church from heresies, which were seen as major threats both to the good of the church and the welfare of the state. The best known and most infamous was the Spanish Inquisition, which started in 1478 and was limited to Spain and its colonies in America. The goal of the Spanish Inquisition was to return Spain to the true faith after almost 800 years of Muslim rule, which meant expelling anyone who wasn't Christian because they were seen as dangerous to the state. The inquisitors sought to identify Jews and Muslims who pretended to convert to Christianity, but continued to practice their former religion. The Church's greatest failure in the Spanish Inquisition was that it was unable to stop the Spanish crown from using the process for political rather than religious purposes. As such, the Church was tarnished by the secular court's use of unjust procedures and excessive punishments. Even though a number of popes protested and attempted to stop these excesses, the Church was powerless to rein in the state. In 1542, the Church founded the Roman Inquisition to defend her doctrine against the heresies of the Reformers. In 1904, it was renamed the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, and renamed again in 1965 as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. This congregation was, and still is, responsible for teaching the true faith and defending Catholic doctrine against error. Its most famous prefect was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who led the congregation for more than 20 years before he was elected Pope Benedict XVI in 2005. Every Catholic should know about the Protestant Reformation and its impact on the Church. By the late Middle Ages, numerous abuses had crept into the medieval church. The unholy alliance between church and state had produced a hierarchy and clergy more interested in gaining power and worldly goods than in saving souls. Many monasteries and religious orders were notorious for their moral failings and scandals. Among the faithful, there was widespread ignorance, superstition, and religious indifference. Add a few bad popes, the death of almost 2/3 of the clergy in the Black Plague, and the lingering memory of the Western Schism, and you've got a church in great need of reform. Meanwhile, an overzealous salesman was traipsing through Europe, handing out indulgences in return for donations to help build St. Peter's in Rome. As the common narrative has it, a Dominican monk named Martin Luther waded into this morass of corruption in 1517. Hammered his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, and set in motion a needed but neglected process of church reform.
In truth, these 95 Theses were not a manifesto for the Protestant Reformation, but rather a set of theological propositions for public debate, most having to do with indulgences and papal authority.
The key Protestant doctrines of sola scriptura and sola fide had not yet been articulated. Like the Inquisition, the Protestant Reformation was not a single event, but rather 3 successive revolts. Luther's rejection of papal authority, Henry VIII's decree making the king the head of the church in England, and John Calvin's teaching that only a few are predestined for salvation. Other movements, such as the Anabaptists or Rebaptizers, also emerged, and were drawing the faithful away into other Protestant congregations. The result was chaos, conflict, and violence. The one holy Catholic Church established by Jesus Christ splintered into dozens, and then hundreds, and today, thousands of Christian denominations and smaller congregations. As a church, we continue to pray with Jesus that all may be one. So, how did the church respond to the Reformers? Every Catholic should know about the Council of Trent and why it was so important.
When Catholics talk about Trent and Tridentine, they are talking about the 19th Ecumenical Council, which, more than anything, marked the emergence of the modern church.
The Council of Trent opened in late 1545 and closed 18 years later in 1563. It wasn't one long meeting, but rather 25 separate sessions under 3 different popes. The purpose of the council was to definitively state Catholic doctrine in answer to the heresies of the Reformers, and to set in motion a thorough reform of the inner life of the Church. No church council has ever had to decide so many significant questions or to carry out its task under more difficult circumstances. Sadly, the council was unable to heal the religious rifts that had opened in Western Europe, but it was very successful in proclaiming divine truth against the false doctrines of the day and for laying a firm foundation for genuine reform in the Church. This process of reform is often called the Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation. Despite the corruption and chaos that marred the late medieval and early modern Church, every Catholic should know that the Church gave shape and beauty to almost every aspect of Western culture. Most of the art in the Renaissance, by artists like Michelangelo and Caravaggio, not only had religious themes, but was commissioned by popes, bishops, and monasteries. The liturgy gave rise to new forms of music, including chant, polyphony, and opera, by Catholic composers like Palestrina, Byrd, and Mozart. Who can deny the Church's role in the development of architecture, including Romanesque, Gothic, and Baroque, still seen in the achingly beautiful cathedrals and basilicas of Europe? And there's more. The Church gave birth to the principles of modern science and introduced legal concepts like international law and human rights. She gave the world universities, hospitals, and charities. In fact, the Catholic Church was the first and is still the largest charitable organization in the world. But challenges for the Church didn't stop with these remarkable achievements. Every Catholic should know about modernism and its impact on the Church. The Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, was a European intellectual movement of the late 17th and 18th centuries that emphasized reason and individualism over tradition and religious belief.
These ideas were eventually recognized as a new system of thought called modernism.
Modernism dropped like a bomb on the Church. It was an attack on her very foundations, an attempt to replace the supernatural Church founded by Jesus Christ with something new, earthbound, and distinctly human.
In welcoming the opportunities presented by science and technology, the Enlightenment thinkers rejected divine revelation and the supernatural order, introducing ideas that would ultimately lead to the bloody French Revolution.
In 1864, Pope Pius IX issued the Syllabus of Errors, which listed 80 errors of the modernists. As you can imagine, no other papal encyclical, before or since, has generated more heat among its detractors. Yet, much of the syllabus is frighteningly prophetic. Among other things, it identified the very ideas that would lead to fascism and communism in the 20th century. But the Church's response to modernism didn't end there. In 1868, Pope Pius IX called the First Vatican Council, after 4 years of planning. Every Catholic should know about Vatican Council I and what happened there. Vatican I, as it's commonly called, opened in December 1869 and closed less than a year later. Its purpose was to formally condemn the errors of modernism. But the council is perhaps best known today for its decree on papal infallibility. That is, the doctrine that the Pope is guided by the Holy Spirit and cannot err when teaching on matters of faith and morals. The outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 interrupted the council, and it was never resumed or officially closed. However, the battle against modernism continued. In 1903, 2 papacies and a number of condemnations later, Pope St. Pius X approved the Index of Forbidden Books, and in 1910 published an oath against modernism that all clergy were required to take. Just 40 priests worldwide refused. The Index and anti-modernist oath were both abolished in the wake of our next topic, Vatican Council II. Every Catholic should know about Vatican Council II and what happened there. As you can imagine, the Church's battle against modernism was met with ridicule and scorn from the intellectual and cultural elites of the day. So, when Pope St. John XXIII announced the Second Vatican Council, the modernists saw it as a victory, the Church admitting that she needed to get with the times. In calling the council, the Pope famously said, "I want to throw open the windows of the Church so that we can see out, and the people can see in." Not surprisingly, many of the faithful were shaken to the core. Vatican II, as it's commonly called, opened in 1962 and closed in 1965 under a new pope, Paul VI, after the death of Pope John XXIII in 1963. Unlike most previous councils, Vatican II was not called to respond to a theological crisis or question, nor did it define any new dogmas or doctrines. Rather, its purpose was to help Catholics apply the truths of Christ and His Church to modern-day life. The Council Fathers wrote 16 documents, including 4 major constitutions, reflecting a new pastoral approach to the Church renewal and the way she carries out her mission in the modern world. Pope Benedict XVI likened the post-council period to a naval battle at night, in a tempest at sea. And yet, the bark of Peter continues its miraculous journey. In the year 2000, the Catholic Church marked the beginning of the new millennium with the Great Jubilee. The celebration included an indulgence that Catholics could receive through pilgrimages to Rome, the Holy Land, or one of many cathedrals or shrines designated by local bishops. During the Holy Year, Pope John Paul II issued an apology and asked forgiveness for the wrongs done by the Church or by those who have borne or bear the name of Christian during the Church's first 2,000 years. The Pope also called for a new evangelization to bring back fallen away Catholics and reach out to a world hungry for God. On February 12, 2013, lightning struck St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, both literally and figuratively, just hours after Pope Benedict XVI announced his surprise resignation from the papacy. 1 month later, Jorge Cardinal Bergoglio, Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Argentina, was elected the 266th Pope, the first non-European. He took the name Francis, signaling perhaps a new pastoral approach to the papacy in the Church's third millennium. So, this is our story, or at least the outlines of our story. It's a story that's still being written today, and you are part of it. So, put on your life jacket, grab a paddle, and enjoy the ride.